This is an introduction to the FortiGate unit and the Unified Threat Management, or UTM, features it has. We'll start out by talking about the major features of the FortiGate unit, and then we'll go over the access management functions. For the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be talking about various things. Some of the other products available from Fortinet, a few of the features that are available on a FortiGate, dealing with administrative access, users and their security profiles, our FortiGuard subscription services, the modes of operation, what the default settings are, doing a configuration backup and restore, the proper procedure to upgrade and downgrade a FortiGate, and the console port. We will be covering a few other topics as well, but these are the primary points. By the end of this module, you should know the major features of a FortiGate, be able to manage administrative access to the device by modifying access restrictions, managing administrative users as well as their access profiles, be able to back up and restore a configuration file, set up a DHCP server, and upgrade or downgrade the firmware. A FortiGate unit is a unified threat management device, but what exactly does this mean? Well, if we look at a typical network solution, it is made up of multiple single-purpose devices, each performing a specific task. There is one device acting as the firewall, another device providing virus scanning, another device filtering email, one device to deliver WAN optimization, another device filtering websites, one device for your application control, one device for the intrusion scanning, one device dealing with the VPNs. That is a lot of different devices doing so many different things, and most likely these services are being provided by multiple vendors. All of this can introduce many points of failure to your environment. A FortiGate unit, however, combines all of this and more into a single device. This way, you only need to access one device, and you can make changes to every aspect of your network and security deployment. Furthermore, these security offerings are based on in-house technologies which do not rely on any third-party vendors. The FortiGate unit provides a comprehensive approach to security. Let's have a brief look at the unit's design approach. What you have is purpose-built hardware, the FortiASIC chip. Obviously, this layer does not apply to virtual machine devices. The next layer is a hardened operating system. The security components and network services lie over the operating system. Finally, there are the FortiGuard subscription services that can be used as well. As you can see already, a FortiGate unit is much closer to an actual computer than it is a traditional firewall appliance. So the big question is then, what can a FortiGate appliance actually do? Let's look at some of the functionality it can provide. This is a rather large list. Keep in mind, this list is not comprehensive. A FortiGate unit can act as your firewall, scan for viruses, filter your email, filter your web traffic, scan for attacks, identify your network traffic, prevent data from getting leaked out of your network, optimize your WAN traffic, handle IPsec and SSL VPNs, manage your wireless controllers, provide both static and dynamic routing, enforce endpoint compliance, manage virtual domains, enforce traffic shaping, can be configured for high availability, provide extensive logging and reporting, and it can provide different types of user authentication. It's a long list, isn't it? As I mentioned, these are only just some of the major capabilities a FortiGate unit offers. The icons in this picture would need to be much smaller if it were to include every feature. Fortinet also offers many other devices which are purpose-built, meaning they only have one particular task, unlike a FortiGate unit which is a multi-purpose UTM appliance. A FortiGate device works closely with the FortiAnalyzer unit, which provides long-term logging and reporting, and the FortiManager unit, which also allows easy manipulation of multiple FortiGate devices at once, as well as some long-term logging and reporting capabilities. It also links with a FortiAP device to provide wider wireless coverage ranges. The FortiGate unit also has hooks for interfacing directly with FortiClient to offer some different features which will be covered in later modules. The only difference between a FortiGate unit and a FortiWi-Fi of the same model, for example, a FortiGate ADC and a FortiWi-Fi ADC, is that the FortiWi-Fi version has a built-in wireless card. There is something to keep in mind with all of this, and that is properly sizing your device. If you size a FortiGate appliance based on it performing just one function, then you will limit yourself because there will be a lot of other features available that you will not be able to use if you do not have the correct CPU or memory requirements. While the FortiGate can do email filtering, it is a firewall. As such, the capabilities it has are limited when you compare it to something like FortiMail, which is specifically designed to filter email and can act as a relay, unlike the FortiGate. So it's important to remember to select the right product for the job. The FortiGate unit also has a global FortiGuard subscription service that can be used. This service provides updates to the antivirus and IPS databases. These two features are static services with a database that updates periodically. There is also a live service available for the web filter and anti-spam components that is separate to the periodic AV IPS updates. This service requires a live, constant connection to the FortiGuard distribution network in order to function as well as a valid contract. There's a short grace period after the contract expires before these features will stop working. AV and IPS scanning will continue to function without a valid contract, but the databases will not update, which means their effectiveness will decline over time. For the live connection or database update, the FortiGate makes a connection to the FortiGuard distribution network. Preference will be given to the nearest server, but the FortiGate unit can obtain its updates from any server available within the network worldwide if the local servers are busy. If it's set up, these updates can come through a FortiManager instead. When you deploy a FortiGate, you can set it up to operate in one of two modes of operation: NAT or transparent. NAT mode is the easiest to explain. The device operates on layer 3, so each interface has an IP address and it handles packet routing like a typical router would. Transparent mode is different. The device operates on layer 2. The unit really doesn't handle routing at all when it's in transparent mode. This is a copy of the 7-layer OSI model. NAT mode operates on layer 3, so it sends packets around based on the IP address. Transparent mode is layer 2. This means the IP doesn't impact where the packet is sent, and it's looking for MAC addresses. Transparent mode can be a complicated method of deployment, but can be advantageous as you would not be required to make any changes to existing network topology. Transparent mode is discussed in more detail in our transparent module. Every FortiGate FortiWi-Fi device has the same default setup. Port 1 or the internal switch, depending on your hardware, will have an IP address of 192.168.1.99 on a /24 subnet with ping, HTTP, and HTTPS access enabled. There will also be a DHCP server on that interface for almost all of the models, so you can easily get an IP. The default username for login is admin with a blank password. Both the password and username are case sensitive. When configuring your device, you should remember to change the admin logging information because the default setup is publicly available knowledge. Your device is only as secure as your admin users, and if you do not alter the default information, all the security in the world will not help you. Now we start talking about a more interesting part of this section, that is, the practical administrative side of a FortiGate unit. There are two ways of administrating a FortiGate unit. The primary method is to use the GUI. You can also use the CLI by accessing the CLI Java widget from the status page, the console port, and SSH or Telnet if they are enabled. Note that anything you can perform in the GUI can also be done using the CLI. The reverse, however, is not true. Some functions are only available in the CLI. Generally, these are more advanced and expert-level options that are not commonly needed. The FortiGate unit was primarily designed to have the bulk of its configuration done through the GUI. The CLI is mainly meant for fine-tuning, tweaking the configuration, and running diagnostics. The GUI design layout is pretty straightforward. Once you log in, you will see all the menu and submenu options listed along the left-hand side, with the main part of the window containing the configuration options for the selected menu item. Once you log in, you can create a new administrative user. You can have different types of administrative users by customizing their profiles. Within the configuration settings for your administrative user, you can see here where you can assign their profile. The admin profile is what determines their access level. In other words, it is what applies restrictions to those user activities on the FortiGate. You can change the administrator's permissions by altering their administrative profiles. Profiles can be customized so that users can have different permissions set for different aspects of the device. Read-only, read-write, and no access are the three possible options for each setting. The super admin is the default profile for the admin user. It is built-in, cannot be changed, and provides the user with full access to everything. Prof admin is a default profile the unit comes with as well. By default, this profile provides full access, but it can be modified. You can also create new admin profiles as well. You can have many different types of users on the FortiGate device. A lower permission level cannot create or even view administrative users that are a higher level. So a prof admin or custom profile administrator can never create or modify a super admin user. Actually, they would never even be able to see a super admin user even exists. Lower permission users cannot see any higher permission users. Another way to make your administrative users more secure is to use the Trusted Hosts feature. This feature does exactly what it says in the GUI. It restricts the user so that unless you are connecting from one of the listed trusted IPs or subnets, then you will not be able to log in to the FortiGate unit. Even if you know the correct username and password to use, if you are not coming from one of the allowed IPs, you will be denied access. This is useful because even if your user's login information is compromised, the login will only be permitted where you specifically allow it. One side effect of this is that if you set up trusted hosts for all of your admin users and they try to connect to the unit from an IP not allowed to connect on it by any users, the FortiGate will not even respond. This applies to all management traffic, HTTP, HTTPS, Telnet, even ping to an interface. The idea here is that if it is not possible for you to log in, resources will not be wasted responding. This also helps prevent inadvertent discovery and identification that you have a FortiGate device within your network. You can also make use of other devices like a FortiToken so that administrative users are forced to use two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication just means that instead of using only one identifier in order to confirm access, a password for example, you use two identifiers. In this case, a password and a randomly generated number. There are a couple of different ways of providing two-factor authentication for an administrative user. The first is to register and use a FortiToken device. A FortiToken device is simply an RSA key generator that is synchronized with the FortiGate unit. Optionally, the FortiGate unit can send an email or an SMS text message. The email address that is used to send is configured here in the GUI. The mail server can be configured under System, Config, Messaging Servers, or in the CLI. Details to use for the SMS are configured from the CLI only. You simply need to enter the administrator's phone number in the GUI. The details required for routing the message to the administrator's phone will need to be obtained by their cellular provider. Now that we have covered the mechanisms for accessing the FortiGate device, let's talk about the unit's configuration aspects. Everyone would agree that configuring a security device is not a small concern. A properly configured device takes careful planning and consideration for many different elements, all working together to secure and make your network operational. Device configuration files can be encrypted with a password if necessary. Besides providing you with some additional security by encrypting your configuration, it also does other things that you might not expect. Once encrypted, the configuration file cannot be decrypted without the password and a FortiGate unit of the same model and firmware the backup was created on. Anytime there is encryption of any sort involved within the configuration file, the algorithm encrypts, hashes, and salts the output. Even if the configuration is not encrypted as a whole, all passwords always are. Keep this in mind when working with the Fortinet support team and you try to send them an encrypted configuration file. To be able to read anything in your encrypted configuration file, they would need to track down the same device as yours, which could cause unnecessary delays in resolving your ticket. If you open the configuration file in a text editor, you'll see that both encrypted and unencrypted configuration files contain a clear text header that also contains some basic information about the device. To restore an encrypted config, you will need to do so on a FortiGate that is the exact same model running the exact same build, as well as you know the encryption password. For an unencrypted config, it only needs to match the exact model. When you use a non-encrypted config on a FortiGate that is the same model but a different firmware, it acts like an upgrade and tries to convert it, so it follows the same limitations as if you were upgrading the firmware. A configuration file only contains non-default settings as well as settings that would be vital in the event of a restore. This helps keep the size down, otherwise even a basic configuration for a low-end device would be a text file that was several megs in size. Configurations can be backed up and restored on a per VDOM basis if you have them enabled, not just for the whole device. A VDOM is a virtual domain. It's like splitting the FortiGate appliance into multiple virtual units. VDOMs are covered in more detail in our VDOM module. Once you have access to your FortiGate unit, it's time to set it up and configure the network interfaces. When the FortiGate device is in NAT route mode, every interface that will be handling or passing traffic must have an IP address. This can be managed in one of three ways, including static IP, DHCP assignment, or PPPoE. There are two other modes available, One-Arm Sniffer and Dedicate to FortiAP. There is a wireless course that will go into detail on the FortiAP. The One-Arm Sniffer can be configured in the GUI and CLI. For the purpose of this course, we will only be using static assignment. Once you have an IP address on an interface, you can select the methods for allowing administrative access. These are things like SNMP monitoring, GUI, and CLI access if the interface will respond to pings or not, settings of that nature. IPv4 and IPv6 management settings are different, so it's possible to have an interface that has both an IPv4 and IPv6 IP, but only respond to pings to one of those IPs. IPv6 will only show up as a configurable option if the feature is enabled to show up in the GUI. This leads to our next point. For the GUI, you have some options in what features you do and do not see. The FortiGate has hundreds of features. Many of them are only configurable from the CLI, but some of them have the option of being in the GUI or hidden. If they are hidden from the GUI, they are not disabled, it simply turns off the ability to configure that feature from the GUI. The primary features you can hide and unhide using the Features widget on the dashboard. This allows you to have the FortiGate act as a firewall in one of several different configurations. The widget only shows the primary features that can be hidden. For a full list of features that can be hidden and unhidden from the GUI, you'll need to go into the Features menu and click Show More. The Features widget has a couple of bulk preset options in regards to features you wish to hide from the GUI. The first is NGFW. This stands for Next Generation Firewall. A next-gen firewall is one that offers line speed inspection with no slowdown of the traffic. Setting up the unit this way will hide all of the UTM options that cannot be used without potentially slowing down the traffic. ATP stands for Advanced Threat Protection. This enables options that focus on providing protection for computers. WF is for Web Filtering. As the name indicates, this applies only to the options that revolve around filtering websites and hides others. The next option, NGFW plus ATP, is not described in text. That is because this option simply has all the options from both NGFW and ATP show up in the GUI. Finally, there is the full UTM preset. All of the available UTM inspection options show up in the GUI. You can also customize the ports that administrative access will use by changing the ports for those services. For better security, it is always best to only use secure, encrypted methods of access. So HTTPS and SSH would be the most secure methods to use. You can also decide if you want to allow multiple concurrent connections from a single user or not. In order for the firewall to be able to do proper routing, you will need to have a default route. If an IP address is being obtained through a dynamic method, then the default gateway information can also be retrieved automatically. Otherwise, a static gateway will need to be configured. Without this, the unit will not be able to respond to packets outside the subnets on its own interfaces. It will also be unlikely to be able to obtain its own updates and may not properly route the traffic that is passing through it. Routing will be covered in more detail in an upcoming module. A FortiGate unit can be configured to act as a DHCP server. To do this, select the interface and enable a DHCP server on it. Once you enable DHCP on that interface, you can manipulate the settings for it. You can set up IP reservations for specific MAC addresses, so those devices will always be issued the same IP from the DHCP server. You can manually set up the MAC address or select a MAC from the list of clients that have already connected to the DHCP server and been issued IPs. DHCP activity shows up in the event log in the router subsection. You can find detailed information about the MAC addresses and IPs by looking in the log details or by looking in the DHCP monitor, which you can also find in the system menu. The FortiGate unit itself can also be configured to act as a DNS server. This allows you to point your internet devices to your FortiGate unit for hostname resolution. Depending on which behavior is required in your environment, one of the three available methods can be used for handling DNS requests: forward only, non-recursive, or recursive. The behavior of the DNS configuration on each interface can be set up separately. Not every interface needs to be acting as a DNS server. Even if they are, they do not need to behave the same way. This feature is only available from the CLI unless you enable the DNS database setting. Another feature of the FortiGate is to do DNS forwarding. You can configure each interface for how you want it to treat DNS requests that are directed at it. This allows you to give a great deal of control over the DNS within your own network without having to set up a separate DNS server. If you use Resolve or have a split DNS setup, you will need to set up a DNS database on the unit so that it has the host names built into its configuration. Zone files must be configured, and your syntax will need to follow the format outlined by RFCs 1034 and 1035. Upgrading the firmware on a FortiGate is quite simple. The easiest method is from the GUI on the status page in the System Information widget and clicking the Update button. In order to make sure your upgrade goes smoothly, any kind of firmware upgrade is always a 6-step process. Step 1. Backup your old configuration. The GUI doesn't do a full backup, just the changes that you made to default settings. This is to help keep your configuration file size down. But just to make sure that you don't lose any information, use the backup option from the CLI and do a full configuration backup. Step 2. Make sure you have a copy of your old firmware available. The FortiGate can convert the configuration between different builds, but in order to minimize risks, it's best to have the exact same version you were running on hand. Step 3. Make sure you have a disaster recovery option on standby. The FortiGate is a security appliance, so if anything goes wrong in the upgrade, there is no backdoor. It's the console port. This doesn't mean you need to be on-site to do an upgrade, but it means you'll need to be aware that you might need to get on-site or get someone on-site if something goes wrong. Step 4. Read the release notes. They contain upgrade and downgrade information as well as any special information you may need to be aware of. They also contain information about known and resolved bugs, so it's worth taking a look to see what you're getting into. Step 5. Double check everything. Open up the config file to make sure the data is there, double check the file details on the firmware copy you have, make sure about the option of physical access, read the release notes a second time to see if there's anything you might have missed. Step 6. Perform the upgrade. Remember, this device does not have backdoors, so if you are doing this from remote and you lose access, your only option to find out what happened is to get physical access, so keep that in mind. Downgrading the firmware is also possible. You will need your old configuration file. One thing to remember is to read the release notes. Sometimes a downgrade between firmware versions is not even possible, like if the operating system changed from 32-bit to 64-bit. If this was the case, then the upgrade release notes would have mentioned it, so that it should not come as a surprise. In that situation, the only way to downgrade will be to format the unit, which we'll cover on the next slide. Once you've determined the downgrade is possible, double check everything and run the downgrade. After the downgrade is finished, you'll be able to log in and restore the configuration backup that you made before the upgrade. When you do a downgrade, you will lose everything in your configuration except what you need in order to get access to the unit, so things like IPs, interface settings, and admin user details. This should not be a problem because in the previous slide, the upgrade procedure involves backing up the configuration, which you can then restore. The last thing we'll talk about is our last resort backdoor user called maintainer. This user is on all FortiGate devices and even some not FortiGate devices like the FortiMail and such. It's a user that's only available through the console port and only after a hard reboot, a physical power cycle. A soft reboot, like issuing a reboot command through the CLI, won't work. The unit needs to be physically shut off and turned back on in order for this to open. That's the difference between a hard boot and a soft boot. Even then, it's only available for login for about 30 seconds after the boot up completes. The user is maintained all in lowercase. The password is BCPB and then the unique serial number of the device. Any letters in the serial number are capitalized. If you have issues with the physical security of your device or have compliance requirements, it's possible to turn off this user in the CLI. However, if you do this and you lose your normal admin passwords, there is no way to recover it. All FortiGates have a console port. On some models, it's a serial port. These would be our older devices. If it's a serial port, then a standard null modem cable can be used to connect with. On other models, it's an RJ45 port, a network jack. If that's the case, then you need to access by using an RJ45 to serial cable. You can't access it over a standard network cable. Other models, the console port is actually a USB 2 port. In that case, you plug the cable into your PC and you can connect using FortiExplorer. Each device ships with a console cable that you can use to access that device and any other device that uses the same method of access. Serial ports on computers are getting uncommon these days, so if you have one of the first two varieties, you can also pick up a USB to serial converter in just about any computer shop. For any device with a USB 2 port and no RJ45 or serial console port, the only way to access the console port is through that USB 2 connection using FortiExplorer. For most other devices with a USB, you can connect with FortiExplorer. The PC and Mac version of the software allows you complete configuration control since you can access both the GUI and CLI. The version for iOS is really intended just to set up IP and routing options to get a new unit up and running in environments so that it can pass traffic and you can access it to do real configuration. It's great because you don't need to pre-configure the firewall when you put it into a data center or bring bulky equipment. Simply cable it up, then plug in your phone or tablet and set up the IP details. Now it's time for the labs. The first lab is simply about getting used to the FortiGate, working with the CLI a little, setting up interface IPs, and working with configuration files. The second lab is optional, and it's all about limiting management access to the unit. The initial lab is pretty short, so you have 10 minutes to complete it. If you finish the first lab, go ahead and move on to lab number 2. This is a look at the topology you'll be using in the lab. The machine you will be working from, your landing machine, has an IP address of 10.0.1.10. You will also have access to two FortiGate units whose IPs are 10.0.1.254 and 10.200.3.1. The two FortiGate devices are called Student and Remote. If the lab requires you to connect to any of these devices, instructions will be provided in your student lab guide.